So Jesus remarkably, and I think there's intentionality in the Spirit moving Matthew and Luke to demonstrate Jesus going even in a narrow slice of the book of Deuteronomy and just leaning back on that. So when he was faced with pressures and hardship, that's what came out because that's what was in. All right. Last Thursday, we did our first unit exercise, the group exercise, and you guys did a great job. We were talking about the Jesus was a prayerful and a personally devoted preacher. We looked probably, and here's the reason why. We look more at Jesus's prayer life because there's a whole lot more explicitly said about his prayer life. You notice that? You pointed out some of the passages. You didn't even look into all the Gospels. There's so much material, I think, especially in Matthew and Luke, that point to Jesus's robust prayer life. And you brought out various thoughts that if the perfect Son of God was continually in need of prayer, we as imperfect followers of him have got to spend adequate time in prayer. Now, not much is said about the Bible study life of Jesus. In fact, I can't think of an explicit statement about that, but what's implied about Jesus, the Bible student?
He grew in stature and wisdom, I believe. I don't know if that adds anything.
Yeah, Luke 2 and verse 52, there's it's implied in that. That's at 12 years old. So from a young age, he was engaged in what would make you wise. And Paul would say later in 2 Timothy 3:15, it's the Holy Scriptures that are able to make us wise. In our case, unto salvation, Jesus was perfect. What else implies that Jesus must have had a good study life?
Well, go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, when facing hardship, as far as the temptation with the devil, he used Scripture to strengthen him.
You know, we had Mike Vestal here. That's a great observation. Mike Vestal was here for our men's retreat over the weekend, and then he stayed over on Sunday and preached on Sunday morning. And he was talking about the Sermon on the Mount and the model prayer. And he said that Jesus withstood the devil using only the book of Deuteronomy. He said, how prepared would you be for battle with the devil if all you had was the book of Deuteronomy and what you knew about it? So Jesus remarkably, and I think there's intentionality in the Spirit moving Matthew and Luke to demonstrate Jesus going even in a narrow slice of the book of Deuteronomy and just leaning back on that. So when he was faced with pressures and hardship, that's what came out because that's what was in. That's good. What else?
Well, the promise that God had made in Isaiah chapter 11, that he would have the spirit of wisdom and the spirit of knowledge, that he would be different, that he would not speak of himself. He would speak of what God commanded him to do. So that connection that he never lost with the Father, his relationship of always being there with the Father.
Certainly. And so there is certainly a uniqueness in what Jesus had in his relationship with God. He had the Spirit without measure, John tells us. And yet, what we have in Jesus is someone I'm thinking about when he's at Nazareth in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4, and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah. And when he gets done with that, he says, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And there are a variety of times throughout his public ministry where he's put to the test. You think about that series of tests that are going to take place in Matthew chapter 21 and 22, where the Sadducees come up to him with a scenario, and he says, "You do err not knowing the scriptures," which he then demonstrates. He goes to the Pentateuch with a group that only saw the Pentateuch as inspired, the Sadducees, nothing else. You think about Jesus quoting the Psalms and saying, the Son of Man, whose son is he? the son of David. Well, why does David call him Lord? And he quotes Psalm 110. And so Jesus had mastered the scripture. Not only did he could quote the scripture, but he knew how they applied to his ministry and how they were fulfilled in him. So even though there's no passage saying that Jesus went apart from the crowd by himself and he studied the scriptures were not as universally available. We take it for granted what kind of access we have to the scripture like no other age in history. Jesus had access to the scroll in the synagogue, and perhaps through both relatives and friends, he could have had access to various parts of the Old Testament, but he studied it and he knew it. And that's demonstrated in his public ministry. All right, so Jesus being our model, that's what you looked at. And we looked at particularly prayer. We're going to do both of those things because it seems to me there's two sides to our personal devotional life. Because every time we mention Jesus and the fact that he is a certain or has a certain emphasis or strength, it's pointing us to the fact that we need that strength as well. Now, I want you to think for a moment about, just put on your ministry glasses for just a second in your local work and answer this question for me. Who do you have responsibility for in the local work? I'm not saying anybody's other's job if you have elders, but who do you have responsibility to in the local work? So kind of break it down for me.
Well,
I would say,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Larry.
I would say to in the local work, as you say, for congregational wise of maybe, I would say the public, because it's important that they know the gospel, and to do the local work, you have to get out there and present the gospel to the lost.
All right. So we're building a list here. On that list, we're going to put the lost in the community. You're responsible to them. Okay. All right. Who else? Good answer.
How about your own family?
You're responsible. Absolutely. All right. So you think in terms of, it would be assumed in 99.9% of all situations that your family would be a part of the congregation where you are. And so if you're married, your wife. If you have children, them as well. All right. So you have a responsibility to the lost in the community, to your family. Who else?
To our own spiritual life.
To
I feel like
ourselves.
sometimes we do enough Bible study for preaching and Bible classes, but not for ourselves.
Absolutely. I've heard it said, is it, well, I'm going to call it personal profit Bible study. And by the way, sometimes out of personal profit Bible study, you're going to get sermon ideas. You're going to get Bible class ideas. It's a kind of a consequence of it. But so often we can find ourselves, it's easy, get into the rut of only studying for material that we're preparing. And there is a particular disconnect that can happen when we're doing an academic exercise and we're not feeding our soul through selfish, self-centered study that we need as a Christian and as a child of God. All right. So we're responsible to self, family, the lost in the community. Who else?
We're responsible to God.
Okay. We're responsible.
We're responsible to God. 1 Timothy 4:16, that if we would speak the word and study the word, the things that will be profitable to us and unto those that hear us, is a direct response to God's will being done in the community.
Yeah,
because
for sure.
People will grow. Yeah,
take heed unto yourself and to the teaching, continue in them, for in so doing you'll save both yourself and those that hear you. But certainly in that context, pay attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. There's a vertical aspect to that as well. Good. All right, who else are we responsible to? Lost, family, self, God. Let's look into the church community for a moment. Let's break that down, because not everybody falls in the same bucket in the local work.
Well, the elders and deacons.
Okay, so if you are scripturally organized, and all I mean by that is if you have the work is at a place where you have men who are qualified to serve in those roles, you have a responsibility to them. You actually have multiple responsibilities to the elders. You are their encouragers, their exhorters. You're also a sheep, and they're under their oversight. Hopefully, we'll talk more about this when we get there. You are partners and friends. At least that's the way it should be. Deacons, they're tasked with the program of work. You're responsible to support, help, promote, encourage them. All right. Who else in that bucket of local work?
Would
You
it
got
be
leadership? But
I was gonna say the young and the old.
okay, so let's put those in two different buckets, right? Because there are peculiar concerns and needs and challenges when you're young. You don't know who you are. You're trying to find your footing. You face some peculiar pressures. You're probably more apt to the lust of the flesh in that particular part of life. When you're elderly, there is loss. There is infirmity. There's fear, anxiousness. So there are, and to the degree that the congregation where you preach, you're going to have more and more insight into specific circumstances in both of those areas, young and old. All right. Who else?
I was going to say to the afflicted in the congregation, as it was mentioning in like Acts, to the widows and the orphans.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, in Acts chapter 6, James chapter 1, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, you're going to have folks who fall into areas of indigence and needing external care by the church or their family that are going to be a part of the congregational life usually.